Applications. Before I get started though, how many of you are non-developers by day? Like either people that are testers or things like that, or all of you guys developers? Okay. So, good. I'm not going to be too far off there, I hope. Hold on. Alright. Couple things, just a little bit about myself. My name is Mitchell Sellers. I'm a C# MVP. I'm down in Des Moines. I run a computer consulting company called Iowa Computer Gurus, work a lot with ASP.NET, the .NET Nuke, open source application framework, and a bunch of other stuff. If you really want to know, ask me afterwards. What I'm going to do tonight is really talking around what it means to manage or diagnose performance-related issues with an application. So I'm going to be talking, I'm going to start out with a disclaimer just because I have to after some feedback from giving this presentation before. Talk a little bit about what it really means to measure code performance, the process, and all of the other things that you need to do before you actually start digging into things, before you start looking at what tools you want to use or how you want to use those tools. What do you have to know before you get into things so that you can make sure that you're actually looking at results that are going to make sense for what you're trying to accomplish, rather than just, oh, wow, this says this is a problem, may not actually be. Then I'm going to talk about a couple of different types of tools, looking at both code quality and more static code analysis tools in terms of how you can use those to assist you with performance-related items. Then I'll talk about actual performance diagnostic tools and ways you can use those to take a deeper look into your applications, how things are running, and have some time at the end for questions. I'll also try to take a quick run through and show you guys a couple things right within Visual Studio. It'll be a little bit complicated because of the way the displays ended up being set up this time, but we'll try to get through that towards the end. I hate to have to start out this way, but I do want to just give you guys a quick disclaimer. I am going to talk about various third-party tools today, talk about tools from Redgate, talk about some tools from other vendors. I'm not being paid by them or anything like that. It's just they're the tools that I've used. I've used all of the other ones. I've used the Visual Studio tools. I've used the tools from the other vendors. These are the tools that I've found that provide consistent results, are easy to use, etc. So there are other options. These are the ones that I've found that work the best for really just digging in and getting things done. So I use them very religiously at all times. So it's one of those things where these are the ones that I talk about for that reason. I'll try to compare and contrast as I talk about the various things as well to kind of let you know why I may have went to one particular tool instead of doing things either within Visual Studio or in other areas. So one of the things that we want to talk about, diagnosing performance issues is always a really tricky situation because when you look at performance, what are you actually looking against? If you're looking at a web application, are you looking at the page load time? If you're looking at page load time, who are you looking at as a user? Are you looking at somebody that's local, somebody that's far away, from a mobile device, from a PC? Are you looking at somebody that's never visited the site before, looking at somebody that's looking at the site for the first time? There's a number of variables that can come into play. Same thing happens from a Windows application perspective. Is it somebody that just launches the application and sees performance issues right away? Have they done other things and it slows down? Those types of things. One question, how many of you are ASP.NET people by default? Okay, and then anything else? WPF, WinForms. Okay. So, I'll kind of try to touch base on both sides since we have a pretty good split. Obviously, the best way to manage performance of an application is to take a look at things in a proactive manner, right? Not to be trying to resolve that user that has a page that's taking 5 minutes to load. To do that, though, takes a lot of upfront effort. You have to be starting an application typically from scratch. You've got to have the time to continuously do things, to continuously test and retest along the way. More likely, what ends up happening is you're doing some form of a reactive analysis of an application. You've gotten to that point where the application's in the wild, maybe you have a lot of users, maybe you have added new features or it's grown over time. The thing is, most of the time that's where we're at, but the problem is that you're set up to be chasing dead ends a lot. Prime example is something that something that would happen like that is you have an application that goes through over time, the amount of data inside of the application grows. We'll consider it a log file. As the application gets older, that data continues to grow, continues to grow, continues to grow. Somebody was working on diagnosing a performance issue in an entirely different section of the application. They were profiling that application. As they were running through trying to recreate what the user was doing, they also decided that they needed to keep looking at the log. When they went and looked at the performance profile results at the end, they saw that the only thing that took any sizable amount of time was that log. Well, they only viewed the log once. All of this other stuff was out of the way, but the thing is, the log, we knew it was going to be slow because it's something that hasn't been optimized, etc. But, you end up chasing your tail if you don't script things in a very, very careful manner. The other thing is that you don't necessarily have a great way to compare and contrast when you're going through and doing things in a reactionary measure unless you take a very methodical approach to it. So what I want to really kind of talk about is how do you devise that test plan? Regardless if you're doing something proactive, if you're trying to react to a performance issue in production, what do you need to do to make sure that you actually have some metrics that you can compare and contrast against? The biggest thing is to develop a consistent plan for your analysis. Control the environment as much as you can. If you are in the unfortunate situation that you're profiling an application in production and it's a web application, no matter how much you try to create a consistent plan, you cannot control it unless you have spare hardware. Because what's going to end up happening is you're going to have users in this system and you're not going to be able to control what they're doing. But in most other scenarios, you're going to be able to create that consistent approach. The thing is, you want to make sure that when you're testing, that you're testing the way that the users are in the application. Not necessarily the way that you as a developer would be going in and doing things. So if the user goes into your application, clicks through 5 pages, goes and does something else, then goes to this page and has a performance problem, make sure that when you're going through and doing all of your metrics, when you're doing your monitoring, go through that same process. Don't just start the application and go to the page that they're having the problem with. Because depending on what was happening, depending on what the scenario was, it could have been something from a previous step in that process. So sitting down with the users, knowing how to recreate those items and knowing how they're in the application is going to be important. It's especially important when you're trying to react to problems, but it's also important when you're going through and validating. If I go and validate the performance of my application and I always go and jump to one section immediately rather than the way the user goes into it, that's how those types of problems get introduced, is when you're trying to bypass that normal flow of what the user's doing. Sure, it works for me, not going to work for the user. The other thing is that depending on the size and nature of your application, the length of your test, the length of monitoring, and what you're trying to accomplish in each individual profiling session can become a little bit of a hindrance, or it could make it so you can't even find any accurate results. If you're too short, you may not get those things that occur over time. If you go in, click 2 buttons, and go out, there's nothing for you to statistically compare the execution of one piece of code against something else. But if you go too long, you can get a couple things. You can run into the scenario like I was talking about a couple minutes ago around that log scenario. Something that might need to take a long time, should take a long time, you wouldn't have needed to profile it. But the other thing that can happen is if you're profiling, especially in production, a lot of the different tools that you can use for analysis will collect and create a lot of data over a very, very short period of time. So trying to dig through and find that one thing that you're looking for after you're doing a production performance analysis, you can sometimes just have so much to wade through that you can't even get through it. An example, profiling web services is one thing that I've been doing a lot of recently, and hooking up to a production WCF service for a company. The whole system was load balanced across 11 servers. We hooked up to one. In 11 minutes, we've generated 2.7 gig of data from a performance profile perspective. So if we left that hooked up any longer, we would have actually ran out of disk space on the server we were using. So you do have to be mindful that if you're profiling anything that's high volume, high traffic, make sure that you are keeping that test as short as you can. That still gets you covering everything that you need to cover from a scenario perspective. Especially if you're doing anything against production, you can run into some really shaky situations there.